How do you fight back when drones, fake notices, and HOA volunteers start surrounding your home? What would you do if an HOA Karen pounded on your door at 3:42 a.m. demanding to inspect a cabin she didn't even control? I thought it was just another tantrum, until I uncovered her plan to take my land. And when drones, floodlights, and a midnight demolition order showed up, I realized this wasn't neighborly drama anymore. It was a full-blown war. The pounding on the front door yanked me out of sleep like a hand on my throat. For a moment I lay still, staring into the dark, listening. The cabin groaned its usual night noises, wind hissing through the pines, the soft wash of lake water on stone. Then the blows came again. 3 hard, flat hits that rattled the hinges and shook dust from the rafters. My phone on the nightstand glowed 3:42 a.m. Beside me, Sarah jerked upright. "Remy," she whispered, already breathing fast. "What is that?" Another barrage hammered the door, closer together now, each strike spaced with the angry precision of someone who believed volume was the same thing as authority. "I hear it," I said. "Stay here a second." The floorboards were cold under my feet as I swung out of bed. I grabbed the flannel shirt from the chair, shrugged it over my t-shirt, and moved through the dark on muscle memory. The air inside smelled like cooled wood smoke and pine sap. Outside, the night was a solid black wall. Then a voice cut through it, sharp and high, and far too awake for this hour. "Cabin inspection! Open this door immediately! This is an emergency HOA inspection!" I stopped in the middle of the room. A mile of dirt road and 200 vertical feet separated us from the nearest subdivision. Out here, you expect coyotes or a drunk fisherman who missed the turnoff, not an HOA. Sarah's bare feet padded up behind me. "Did she just say HOA?" she asked, tying her hair into a quick knot. "Sounds like it," I said. "At 3:42 in the morning." "I know you're inside," the woman shrieked from the porch. "I can see a light. You are required to submit to inspection under Section 12, Emergency Aesthetic Review Protocols." The words tumbled out of her with the frantic rhythm of someone who half remembered them from a meeting handout. Instead of going straight to the door, I slipped to the side window and eased a finger under the curtain. Bethany Reed stood on my porch like she'd planted the posts herself. Even in the harsh cone of her own flashlight, there was no mistaking her. President of the Clearwater Bluffs HOA, queen of mailers and meeting minutes. She wore a silky floral robe and fuzzy slippers, her hair twisted up in a clip that had given up the fight an hour ago. A thick folder was tucked under one arm. In her free hand, she held a single sheet of paper up like a warrant and slapped it against my cabin post, tape dangling from one corner. Dust floated in the beam with each smack. 2 deputies flanked her. The younger one, Jake, shifted from foot to foot, breath smoking in the cold, eyes flicking between Bethany and my door like he'd drawn the short straw. The older one stood a step back with his arms folded, patrol SUV lights blinking faint red and blue through the trees behind him. Even through the glass, his posture said he'd rather be almost anywhere else. Sarah leaned in beside me and peered through the gap. "Fantastic," she muttered. She brought backup. Outside, Bethany's voice climbed a notch. "This cabin has been reported for multiple violations affecting community standards, lake visibility, and nighttime light pollution. It falls within our 3-mile aesthetic jurisdiction. You cannot alter the character of our viewshed without board approval." Our viewshed. There it was again. My grandfather had bought this strip of rock and pine and shoreline before Clearwater Bluffs was a surveyor's sketch. He built the first version of this cabin with his own hands. But in Bethany's world, if you could see something from the right angle of her cul-de-sac, it belonged to her committee. The jolt of fear that woke me cooled into something steadier. For months, she'd been circling us with anonymous letters and friendly reminders. This, apparently, was the next step. "All right," I said quietly. "Let's not drag this out." I crossed to the door, flipped on the porch light, and watched Bethany flinch as warm yellow washed over her. She spun toward the younger deputy and jabbed a finger at the fixture above the door. See? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Excessive lumens. That light is visible from the cul-de-sac. It destroys the night ambience. We were 1.5 miles and a steep climb from her cul-de-sac. But Bethany has always treated facts like optional accessories. I slid the deadbolt back but kept the door mostly closed. Ready? I asked Sarah over my shoulder. She crossed her arms, bare feet planted on the worn planks, chin lifting. Always, she said. She doesn't own the air up here. I cracked the door and stepped into the gap, letting a ribbon of cold air and the smell of damp moss and lake water curl around my ankles. Under it, I caught a faint hit of Bethany's perfume, too sweet for this hour. Bethany, I said. Deputies. Her eyes widened, as if she'd expected a wild-eyed squatter instead of a man in flannel. Finally, she snapped. You are in violation of multiple HOA provisions, Mr. Cole, starting with unauthorized structural modifications, non-compliant exterior lighting, and an aggressively rustic aesthetic that degrades the harmony of Clearwater Bluffs. I don't live in Clearwater Bluffs, I said. You know that. She thrust the paper toward me until the edge almost touched my nose. As of last month, the board voted to extend our aesthetic jurisdiction to all properties within a 3-mile visual radius of the community. Your cabin is clearly visible from the Upper Ridge Trail. That makes it subject to review. Behind her, Jake cleared his throat. Ma'am, like I said on the way up. She silenced him with a sharp flick of her wrist. Officer, you are here to maintain order, not to question HOA policy. This is an emergency inspection. There have been anonymous reports of suspicious roof angles, potentially hazardous chimney, emissions, and unapproved shoreline lighting that could encourage loitering. Sarah's fingers brushed the small of my back, a tiny steadying touch. Ask her, she murmured. What statute covers suspicious roof angles? I could use a laugh. I met Bethany's stare. Anonymous reports, I repeated. From who? Because up here, the neighbors are mostly deer and trout. Complainant identities are confidential, she said crisply. The important thing is that the board is concerned. So concerned, I said. You woke us up before 4, dragged 2 deputies up a 1-lane dirt road, and are now yelling about my porch light. It's not about the light, she shot back. It's about precedent. If we allow one outlier structure to pollute the viewshed, property values will nosedive. Buyers pay for curated wilderness. That, she jabbed past me at the log walls, isn't curated. It's frontier. It sends the wrong message. Jake pressed his lips together like he was holding in a comment. The older deputy finally spoke, voice calm. Mr. Cole, he said, we're not here on a warrant. Ms. Reed requested our presence. You're under no obligation to allow an inspection tonight. Bethany whirled on him. He absolutely is. Our bylaws clearly state, your bylaws, Sarah said, her tone still quiet but edged in steel. Stop at the edge of your recorded plat. This cabin sits on a separate parcel that predates your HOA by 42 years. Clearwater Bluffs ends at the county road. You know that. Our office sent your attorney a letter spelling it out. Bethany's head snapped toward her. And you are? My wife, I said, and the land rights attorney who wrote that letter. For a beat, uncertainty flickered behind Bethany's eyes. Then the flush on her neck deepened. Well, letter or no letter, she said, the community has expectations. As HOA president, I have a duty to act when outsiders threaten the character of our environment. If you refuse this inspection, we will escalate. Daily fines, liens, legal action. Once, that list might have tightened a knot in my gut. I've seen what fear of an HOA can do to people who don't know where its power actually stops. But I'd also spent 20 years designing spillways and emergency release channels, learning that pressure only matters if the walls aren't built right. Right now, Bethany was all pressure. "I'm not refusing anything," I said. "I'm telling you there's nothing for your HOA to inspect. This is private land outside your jurisdiction. My grandfather's name is on the old deed. Mine's on the new one. The county maps agree. You don't get to vote your way onto my property." "You can wave your little papers around all you want," she said, not hearing herself. "But the board has spoken. You are within our radius. You will comply." She slapped the notice onto the porch post one last time, tape finally catching. Her hand shook now, more from anger than cold. I glanced at the older deputy. He met my eyes and gave the smallest shrug. He knew. And he knew I knew he knew. Sarah's voice was close to my ear. "We're not going to fix this at the door," she said. "Let her talk. Take her paper. We'll answer her in daylight with the law." The pounding in my chest eased. I nodded. "All right, Bethany," I said. "You've posted your notice. You've stated your position. The deputies have done their part. It's 3:42 in the morning on private land. This conversation is over." Her mouth opened. "You can't just—" But I could. I eased the door closed, not slamming it, just reclaiming the doorway inch by inch while the cold air thinned and the warmth of the cabin wrapped back around us. "You haven't heard the last of this," she shouted through the narrowing gap. "You and your little lake cabin are in violation, Mr. Cole. I will protect this community if it kills me." "That's what worries me," I said under my breath. The latch clicked. For a few seconds, the porch light still painted her and the deputies in warm yellow through the glass. Then Sarah reached up and flipped the switch, and the outside world dropped back into shadow, broken only by the soft blink of the cruiser's lights and the pale stripe of lake between the trees. We stood there listening. Bethany's voice came muffled now, more tone than words. The older deputy answered in a low rumble. Boots thudded on the steps, gravel crunched, a car door slammed. The engine turned over and faded down the road. A minute later, the only sounds left were the creak of settling beams and the steady hush of water on stone. Sarah let out a long breath. "Well," she said, dry, "that's one way to start a morning." I stared at the faint rectangle of the notice on the porch post, just visible through the glass. Part of me wanted to yank it down and feed it to the wood stove. Another part, the engineer who trusted paper trails and pressure readings, knew better. "Leave it," I said. "We're going to need everything she puts in writing." Sarah studied my face for a moment. "You really think she's going to push this?" Outside, the forest was quiet again. But Bethany's last words echoed in the back of my mind like distant thunder. "No," I said finally. Tonight was just the knock on the door. I turned away from the entry, feeling the chill of the floorboards in my feet and the weight of what was coming settle into place. "Whatever she's really planning," I said, "hasn't even started." By the time dawn seeped between the window panes, painting the cabin in pale gold, neither of us had slept. The lake outside was still slick and silver, steam drifting off its surface like it was thinking out loud. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, the boards creaking beneath my weight, and stared at the violation notice Bethany had taped to the post. Dew beaded on the cheap paper, softening the ink, but her handwriting, sharp, slanted, frantic, remained perfectly legible. Before I could tear it down, gravel crunched on the road below. A county SUV eased to a stop near the gate, dust lifting behind it in a lazy ribbon. Sheriff Marcus stepped out, adjusting his jacket against the cold. He wasn't a man who hurried unless he had to, but this morning he moved with purpose, his boots steady on the damp ground. "Morning," he called up. "Mind if I come in?" Sarah appeared beside me, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "We figured we'd see you today," she said. Marcus climbed the steps and nodded toward the notice on the post. "She was at it early." "She never really stopped," I said. He let out a slow exhale. "Well, that lines up with what I came to tell you." The sheriff stepped inside the porch light's reach, the lines on his face deeper than usual. "You two should know, this isn't her first attempt to grab territory that isn't hers. We've had 4 complaints in the last year from landowners along the ridge. Same story every time. She shows up with paperwork, claims extended jurisdiction, and tries to pressure folks into accepting her authority." Sarah blinked. "4?" she said. "That's a pattern. Why didn't anyone push back?" "They tried," Marcus said. "But most of them are older, or seasonal, or just tired of conflict. She knows exactly who to target. People who don't want to fight an HOA in court." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, but recognition. This wasn't random harassment. This was strategy, clumsy but ambitious. She wasn't just after peace and quiet or a better view. She was building something, and she was convinced the rules would bend for her. "Why us?" I asked. Marcus rubbed his jaw. "Word is she's been trying to impress a developer. Some outfit out of Denver sniffing around for lakeside property to reimagine into a lifestyle community. Her words, not mine." The morning air felt suddenly heavier. Sarah stepped closer. "So she thinks folding our land into her HOA makes it easier to sell later?" "Looks that way," Marcus said. "She pitched the idea at a council luncheon last fall. Thought no one would repeat it." He lowered his voice. "But folks talk. And Bethany ignores every no until someone in a uniform repeats it to her." I exchanged a look with Sarah. Her eyes had shifted from concern to calculation. The same look she used when she was about to dismantle a legal argument word by word. "Sheriff," she said, "our deed predates Clearwater Bluffs by over 4 decades. This land was surveyed and registered long before a single roofline in that subdivision existed. The only jurisdiction here is county, not HOA." "I know," he said, "but she doesn't want to hear it." I went inside and returned with the old leather folder that held the property documents passed down from my grandfather. The paper rustled softly in the morning breeze as Sarah laid out the maps, yellowed but clear, black ink marking boundaries with steady confidence. Marcus studied them, hands on his belt. "Well," he said, "this is as solid as it gets. She can't touch you with this on record." "Doesn't stop her from trying," I said. He gave a slow nod. "No, but it gives me something to lean on." For a moment, the 3 of us stood there in the crisp morning light, the lake gleaming beyond the trees. It almost felt peaceful again, until a distant engine revved on the road below. I stepped to the edge of the porch. A silver SUV paused at the turn, its window lowering just enough for me to see a familiar silhouette behind oversized sunglasses. Bethany, staring up at the cabin like she was measuring the slope for a future fence line. The moment our eyes met, she jerked the car forward and sped down the road, dust rising behind her in a hard brown plume. Marcus watched her disappear. "See that?" he said. "She's not done." No, she certainly wasn't. Sarah gathered the old documents and slid them back into the folder. "Remy," she said, "we need to pull the modern county records too. If she filed anything recent, we'll find it." Marcus tipped his hat. "You two handle the paperwork. I'll handle her when she crosses the line again. And trust me, she will." The sheriff walked back toward his SUV, boots leaving prints in the soft earth. When his engine faded, the quiet returned, but it felt different now. Charged, waiting. Sarah rested her hand on the porch rail, her breath warming the cold morning air. "This wasn't just her being dramatic," she said softly. "She's after your land. Our land." I nodded slowly, watching a thin sheet of wind ripple across the lake's surface. Then we'll show her what real boundaries look like. But even as I said it, Bethany's last glance replayed in my mind. Sharp, calculating, certain she held the advantage. I had the uneasy sense that she'd already made her next move, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be subtle. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared into a pale, cloudless blue, the kind that made the lake shine like polished glass. I stepped out with a fresh mug of coffee, hoping the quiet would settle my thoughts. But the moment my boot touched the porch, something fluttered near my feet. A paper, bright white against the weathered wood. Then another, and another. My porch post was plastered with notices, dozens of them. The tape crisscrossed like someone had tried to gift-wrap the entire house in bureaucratic rage. Pages curled in the sun, rustling with the breeze, each one stamped with bold, unnecessary red ink. I pulled the first sheet off. Unofficial structure height disparity. The next, unauthorized cabin roof tone. Then, dangerously confident chimney angle. I stared at that one. Dangerously confident wasn't even a real term in construction. I would know. I'd spent years designing concrete spillways and intake towers that survived hurricane winds. But apparently my little wood-burning chimney was giving off swagger. Sarah stepped out beside me, holding her hair back from the breeze. "She was busy," she murmured. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, because I had too many. Before I could collect my thoughts, a faint hum rose from the tree line. A drone appeared above the ridge, catching the sunlight on its silver frame. It floated toward us with a slow, deliberate drift, like a dragonfly that knew exactly where it was going. The lens angled down. The drone hovered, watching. "That's new," Sarah said under her breath. The drone dipped lower, its propellers whining against the still morning air. A sudden gust pushed pine needles across the porch, scattering the papers at our feet. The drone surged forward, almost aggressively, testing how close it could get. I raised a hand. "Back off," I muttered. Not that a drone cared what I thought. It didn't move. Instead, it angled sideways, giving us a perfect view of a neon sticker slapped across its underside. Property of Clearwater Bluffs HOA Aesthetic Compliance Division. I felt my jaw tighten. She's got a compliance division now. She probably knighted them herself, Sarah said. The drone finally drifted backward, rising above the trees, before shooting off toward the far ridge like it had collected whatever evidence Bethany wanted. We barely had time to process that when movement flickered along the property line. Two figures stepped from behind a cluster of aspens. Older folks from the subdivision, wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards. They looked like retirees drafted for a mission they didn't fully understand. One pointed at the boundary stakes. The other squinted at his clipboard as though reading a sacred text. I walked toward them, hands in my pockets, boots crunching over the frost-softened earth. They froze like deer at the sound of a rifle click. "Morning," I said. "Something I can help you with?" The woman tugged her vest straight. "We're with the HOA Beautification Task Force," she announced, as if reciting lines. "We're performing an official terrain compatibility assessment." Sarah whispered behind me, "I'm going to lose it." The man cleared his throat. We're supposed to inspect the property line for encroachments and, assess the lake's reflective consistency." I blinked. Reflective consistency. He checked his clipboard again. "Yes, that's what it says." I planted my feet. "This land is privately owned, not part of Clearwater Bluffs, not subject to their assessments. You both need to step off my property." The couple exchanged nervous glances. Then the woman lifted her walkie-talkie. "Task Force to Commander Reed," she whispered. "The target is uncooperative." Sarah pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Did she just call you the target?" They all need new hobbies, and I said. The volunteers backed away, muttering to each other, then disappeared into the trees, their vests catching flashes of sunlight as they hurried downhill. For several minutes, silence returned. It felt brittle, like the forest was waiting to see if everything would snap at once. Inside, Sarah gathered the stack of notices from the table and fanned them out. "She's escalating," she said, "and she's doing it fast. This isn't frustration. This is coordinated." I nodded slowly. "She wants to overwhelm us, make us slip, or scare us into compliance." "We won't," Sarah said, "but it means she's preparing something bigger, something she thinks she can win." The drone's distant hum drifted back briefly before fading. The papers lay across the table, each one more absurd than the last, but the intent behind them wasn't funny. It was pressure, constant, strategic, and deliberate. I stepped out again, the breeze brushing cool against my face. Across the lake, sunlight glinted off the calm surface, glittering like shards of glass. The world looked peaceful, but Bethany's shadow stretched longer than the morning light. She wasn't improvising. She wasn't guessing. She was building something. A case. A narrative. A claim. And I had a feeling we'd only seen the lightest part of it. Later that afternoon, the wind picked up from the west, carrying the scent of damp pine and distant rain. Sarah had been quiet for an hour or two, sitting at the dining table with her laptop open, the old leather deed folder beside her. Her fingers moved with a steady rhythm across the keys. Soft taps, occasional pauses, then more taps. I recognized that pace. It was the pace she used when the ground under someone else's feet was about to shift. "Remy," she said finally, without looking up, "you need to see this." I pulled out the chair across from her. The sunlight fading through the windows cast long amber stripes on the wooden floor. Sarah turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a scanned document, official letterhead at the top, black ink, crisp, typed paragraphs, clean and orderly. But the name printed on the bottom caught me like a hook. Petitioner, Clearwater Bluffs Homeowners Association, filed by Reed, Bethany A. I skimmed it, confused at first, then more confused when the language sank in. Community Expansion Petition, I read aloud. Proposed annexation of adjacent unincorporated land parcels, including shoreline, structures, and access easements, submitted for immediate review and automatic adoption if no dispute filed within 60 days. My voice caught at the next line. Claim. The cabin dwelling located on Parcel 14B has been abandoned for a period exceeding 11 years. Abandoned. 11 years. My grandfather died 10 years ago, I said quietly. I moved back within weeks. Everyone up here knows that. Sarah nodded, jaw tight. And the county records know it too. But if this had slipped through unnoticed, if no one objected within the deadline, Clearwater Bluffs would have gained claim over your land on paper. And from there, they could argue for jurisdiction, fines, enforcement. Control, I said. And eventual sale, Sarah added. I felt the wood grain under my palms, steady, familiar, grounding, while the air around me seemed to thin. The petition was dated 6 months ago, meaning Bethany had been planning this long before she ever stepped onto my porch. Why now? I muttered. Why the sudden escalation? Sarah clicked another tab. The page that opened was a planning commission agenda from last month. One line stood out, bolded in the minutes. Preliminary inquiry submitted by Ridgeview Development Group regarding potential lakeside redevelopment opportunities pending jurisdictional confirmation. She's courting them, Sarah said, trying to make the land look available. If your cabin were labeled abandoned and absorbed into the HOA's territory, she could pitch it as a blighted structure ready for redevelopment. The thought made something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. The lake, the cabin, the land my grandfather had tended. It wasn't an eyesore to her. It was currency. "Look at this," Sarah continued, zooming in on a small note scribbled in the margin of the petition. Handwriting slanted, aggressive, unmistakably hers. "Property owner unlikely to contest. Remote location. Limited legal sophistication." My jaw tightened. "She thinks we won't fight." "She thinks we can't fight," Sarah corrected. A gust of wind rattled the cabin windows. The lake outside darkened under a shifting cloud, turning from bright silver to cold steel. For a moment, it felt like the entire forest had leaned closer, listening the way we were listening, to the truth, to the threat. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. "Has the petition been reviewed?" Sarah shook her head. "It was routed for verification, but the clerk suspended it after noticing inconsistencies in Bethany's filing dates. That bought us time, but we need to file a formal objection and attach the original deed records. If we don't, she'll just refile it." I leaned back, staring at the timber beams overhead. My grandfather had placed each one by hand. The walls held stories, storms, winters so cold, the lake froze solid from shore to shore. And here was an HOA president trying to erase all that with a few signatures and a fabricated timeline. "We're not going to let that happen," I said. "No," Sarah agreed. "We're not." She pulled out the county plat maps, laying them across the table. They were old enough to smell faintly of ink and dust. Her finger traced the boundary lines, steady and sure. "She made a mistake," Sarah said. "Two, actually. First, she claimed abandonment, but your utility records and tax filings contradict that. Second, she tried to expand jurisdiction without community consent. That petition alone can get her censured." I let out a slow breath. "So the cracks are already there." "Big ones," Sarah said. For a brief second, the tension in my shoulders eased. Not because we were safe, not yet, but because the truth finally had shape. Bethany wasn't omnipotent. She was reckless, ambitious, sloppy in ways she didn't realize because no one had challenged her before. Wind rippled the lake again, and the last bit of sunlight flared soft gold against the far hillside. I stood and stepped to the window, watching the pines sway like tall shadows. It would have been peaceful if not for the faint unease crawling up my spine. Sarah closed the laptop and set a gentle hand on my arm. "Remy," she said, "this isn't just a power trip. It's land theft. She's building a false narrative so she can claim your cabin and lake access as part of her community." "And she's already started the paperwork," I said. "Exactly." Outside, a single bird cut across the sky, wings slicing the last of the daylight. Then silence settled again. A thick, heavy quiet that didn't feel natural. Sarah's voice softened. "County offices open at 8 tomorrow. We'll be there when the doors unlock. We'll pull every filing she's made, cross-check it with the deed, and file a challenge before she gets anywhere near the approval window." I nodded. "Good." But even with a plan forming, the unease didn't fade. It deepened. Because if Bethany had already lied to the county, boldly, confidently, there was no telling what she'd try next to force her way up this hill. The petition wasn't the escalation. It was the warning. And I had a sense the real storm was already gathering, just out of sight, somewhere in the trees between her world and mine. The next morning broke with a sky washed pale gray, the kind of color that made the lake look colder than usual. Mist hovered low across the waterline, drifting like slow breath escaping from the earth. I stepped outside with a second cup of coffee, hoping the quiet would settle something inside me, but the air felt charged, watchful. A low rumble of tires on gravel pulled my eyes toward the gate. A sheriff's truck eased up the drive, the dust behind it rolling in soft waves. Sheriff Marcus stepped out, hat in hand, surveying the porch as if expecting trouble to materialize right where Bethany had stood 2 days earlier. "You got a minute?" he called. "Always," I said, motioning him up. Sarah joined us, pulling her sweater tight against the cool breeze. Marcus adjusted his belt, his expression heavier than usual. "Wanted to stop by before I start my rounds," he said. "There's something you two need to know." The way he said it made the hair on my arms lift. Sarah folded her arms. "Is this about the petition?" "In part," Marcus said, "but it's more than paperwork now. Bethany's been on the phone every evening with dispatch. First night, she claimed you were constructing an unauthorized water diversion. Second night, she said you were letting smoke signals off the chimney to communicate with unknown parties. Last night, she insisted you were tampering with protected wildlife habitats." I blinked. Wildlife habitats? She wouldn't clarify what species. His voice dipped dryly. "My guess is whatever sounded official." Sarah exhaled hard, shaking her head. "She's creating a record," she said. "A false trail, a pattern of alleged violations she can use to justify intervention." Marcus nodded. "That's what concerns me. Dispatch logs every call. Enough of those complaints, even baseless ones, and someone at the state office might take her seriously. She's manufacturing urgency. And she expects you to enforce it," I said. "She wants someone in uniform to validate her version of reality," Marcus answered. "And to be frank, not every officer knows the county line or the history of every parcel. Someone fresh out of training could see a stack of complaints and assume there's something happening up here." A gust of wind rustled the pines. The cabin creaked softly, as though acknowledging the truth of his words. "But here's the part you really need to hear," he continued, leaning a little closer. "Bethany isn't reacting. She's pushing. Every time she hits a wall, she pivots. It's not randomness, it's escalation. That's why I'm here before things get messy." Sarah exchanged a glance with me. "Messy how?" He rubbed his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "People like Bethany, they don't quit when they're wrong. They double down, and when their imaginary authority starts slipping, they look for ways to force it back into place. Sometimes that means paperwork. Sometimes that means showing up at people's doors at 3 a.m. And sometimes," he sighed, "sometimes they try to make the world match the picture in their head." The breeze shifted again, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something faintly metallic. A distant bird cried out across the lake. The world felt still, but listening. "So what do we do?" I asked. "Document everything," he said firmly. "Every notice she posts, every drone she flies, every encounter you have with her or her volunteers. Take pictures, record timestamps, keep copies. If this escalates, and trust me, it will, you'll need that paper trail." Sarah nodded slowly. "We started a binder." "Good," he said. "Fill it." He stepped to the porch rail and looked out at the lake, his voice lowering. "I'm filing my own incident report about the misuse of emergency services. It won't stop her, but it'll put weight on the other side of the scale." "Makes a difference?" I asked. "When the time comes," Marcus said, "it will." We stood there with him for a while, the silence stretching as the morning light climbed over the treetops. A soft ripple moved across the lake's surface as if stirred by something unseen beneath. I felt Sarah shift beside me, close, steady. "Remy," the sheriff said after a moment, "you're not alone in this. I've dealt with folks who get tangled in their own authority before. But Bethany, she's on the edge of something, and people on that edge don't like to look down." He tipped his hat and stepped off the porch. I watched his truck roll down the driveway, dust rising behind the tires like a soft curtain falling back into place. After he disappeared around the bend, Sarah let out a slow, thoughtful breath. "So now we know," she said. "She's not just overzealous. She's unstable. And persistent, I added, and dangerous if cornered. The breeze picked up again, rattling a lone violation notice that had escaped into the porch corner. Its edges curled like a dry leaf. I plucked it up and turned it over, the ink smeared slightly from yesterday's fog. Dangerously confident chimney, I read aloud. I ought to frame this. Sarah offered a tired smile. Don't tempt her. She might show up demanding royalties. But the humor didn't sit long. The sheriff's warning lingered like a shadow stretching across the porch. Bethany wasn't improvising. She was maneuvering. And people who maneuver without reason often cross lines without hesitation. I set the notice aside. We go to the county first thing tomorrow. We get the petition blocked, the records updated, and every false claim documented. And after that? Sarah asked. I looked toward the tree line, where the drone had hovered earlier. The forest beyond seemed too quiet, too still, as if the air was holding its breath. After that, I said, we see just how far she's willing to push, and how far the law will push back. But Bethany didn't wait for tomorrow. Golden hour draped the lake in warm amber light that stretched across the water like melting glass. The porch boards beneath my boots glowed softly, carrying the warmth of the day. I just stepped outside to check the gate when a sharp whistle sliced through the quiet. The sound bounced between the pines. Then an engine roared up the hill. A sedan I recognized. A pale blue compact with HOA decals skidded to a stop just beyond the porch. Dust rolled around it in a thick plume, catching the light like storm clouds. The passenger door flew open before the dust cleared. Bethany Reed marched out. She wasn't wearing her robe tonight. Instead, she'd upgraded to a bright blazer and a clipboard strapped to her chest like a tactical vest. A stack of new notices slapped against her leg with each step. 2 uniformed officers trailed behind her, different from yesterday, younger, more unsure. Their patrol car idled with lights flashing softly through the trees. "Mr. Cole," she shouted, as if calling roll in a classroom. "You are in direct violation of urgent HOA aesthetic compliance orders." I didn't move. Sarah slipped beside me, arms folded, expression already sharpening. The porch felt like the border of 2 countries, ours made of timber, lake air, and old legal deeds. Hers made of bylaws, ego, and desperation. Bethany stormed up the porch steps without waiting for permission. As president of the Clearwater Bluffs HOA, I am authorized to issue correction notices at any time when community harmony is threatened. And this, she slapped a folded packet against my porch beam, is a threat. The impact kicked a puff of dust into the last rays of sunlight. Particles floated between us like tiny sparks. "Ma'am," one of the officers said quietly. "Maybe let's—" "No," she snapped. "You're here to witness. Stand there and don't interfere." The taller of the 2 officers shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. Their tension thrummed in the air, mixing with the hum of insects settling in the branches above. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "You misled these officers. Again." Bethany swung her glare toward her. "I told them exactly what's happening. You are refusing compliance with mandatory visual standardization requirements. This cabin isn't part of your HOA, Sarah said. You know that." Bethany brushed the statement aside. "We extended jurisdiction." "No," Sarah corrected. "You attempted to. There's a difference." Bethany's jaw twitched. She slapped another notice onto the porch post, layering it over yesterday's. "Unauthorized timber tone variance," she barked. "Unapproved window placement, excessive rusticity, and," she paused for dramatic effect, "a non-conforming walkway slope." I almost laughed. "A slope? That's nature, Bethany." "Nature," she said, as though insulted by the word, "is only as beautiful as those who protect it from negligence." Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something worse. A pair of bolt cutters. The metal glinted in the fading sun, catching streaks of orange and red. She weighed them in her hands, as if deciding where to apply them first. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked. "What you refused to do," she said. "Correcting violations. Your gate is obstructing the visual corridor of the community's northern viewpoint. Under emergency authority, I can remove barriers that hinder aesthetic cohesion." "You're not touching my gate," I said. She lifted the bolt cutters anyway, stepping toward the bottom stair. The officers flinched but still didn't intervene. Not yet. Sarah moved beside me, chin raised. "Put those down." Bethany didn't. Her breathing grew harsher, her face flushed with effort or rage, maybe both. "You will not undermine my authority again," she hissed. Just then headlights swept across the trees, bright white beams cutting long shadows across the yard. A truck rumbled closer, gravel crackling under the tires with a familiar rhythm. Sheriff Marcus stepped out before the dust settled. He took in the scene, Bethany clutching bolt cutters like a misplaced pioneer tool, officers unsure, Sarah standing rigid beside me, and his jaw locked. "Ms. Reed," he said, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the standoff, "you will put those tools down immediately." Bethany turned to him, defiant. "Sheriff, I am acting under HOA emergency protocol. These people are obstructing community beautification initiatives." "You are trespassing," Marcus said firmly, "and you are misleading officers again." "This land falls under our jurisdiction," she insisted. "It does not," Marcus said. "You've been told that, in writing, by attorneys, and by me. You do not have the authority to enforce anything here." Bethany's hands trembled on the bolt cutters. "I am protecting property values. You should be thanking me." The taller officer cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, the sheriff outranks—" "Quiet," she snapped. But the officers were no longer looking at her. They were looking at the sheriff. Marcus stepped up onto the porch, boots landing with a deliberate thud. "Ms. Reed, I'm giving you one final warning. You will remove your tools, your notices, and yourself from this property." Bethany looked at the sheriff, then at me, then at the bolt cutters. Finally, she lowered them, slowly, reluctantly, as if obeying gravity rather than authority. "This isn't over," she whispered. "You cannot ignore community standards. You cannot sit on a hill above us like tyrants. You will comply one way or another." She turned and marched down the steps, her blazer catching the wind like a small, furious sail. The two officers followed, embarrassed but relieved. Marcus remained with us, watching her shrink into the fading light. The forest swallowed the last of her footsteps. "You two all right?" he asked. "For now," I said. "Good," he said. "Because she just crossed a line, and next time she may not stop at bolt cutters." The lake shimmered in the dying sunlight, its calm surface a strange contrast to the storm she carried with her everywhere she went. Something told me she wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. Sarah stood beside me, arms still folded, watching the dust settle at the bottom of the hill where Bethany's car had disappeared. The warm gold of sunset softened the sharp lines of her face, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She felt it too, that unsettling quiet before something snaps. "She's going to come back," Sarah murmured. "Yeah," I said, "and she'll come back louder." We stayed there until the sun dipped behind the ridge, letting the cool evening creep across the porch boards. The last birds quieted, their songs swallowed by the slow rise of crickets. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. We slept lightly that night, waking at every rustle as pine branches scraped the cabin roof. But dawn arrived without incident, painting the lake in soft pastels. Sarah brewed coffee while I checked the property line for new surprises. Nothing yet. But the absence felt temporary, like the forest itself was bracing. By 8, we were at the county office, a low building with wide windows and the faint smell of old paper. The clerk recognized Sarah almost immediately. "You back about the Reed filings?" she asked, tapping her pen against a stack of folders. Sarah nodded. "We need to file a formal objection to the expansion petition and register a complaint regarding fraudulent jurisdiction claims." The clerk pushed up her glasses. "About time someone did." Within an hour, the objection was stamped, signed, and added to the official record. The petition was no longer suspended. It was effectively dead. But the bigger blow came next. The clerk handed us a printout with a raised brow. "She also submitted 3 more complaints against you last night, all baseless." Sarah exhaled sharply. "She's trying to drown the record." "Not anymore," the clerk said. "We're flagging her name for review and, given the volume of filings, the sheriff might advise the court about harassment." It was Sarah who said it first. "We're filing for a restraining order." I followed her gaze. She wasn't looking at the clerk. She was looking at me, checking if I was ready, if I was willing. And I was. We filed the request before noon, attaching printouts of notices, drone photos, the false petition, and Marcus's incident report. The county judge wasn't in that day, but his clerk assured us he reviewed emergency filings in the evenings. "He'll likely sign this tonight," she said. Tonight. Something about that word sent a small ripple down my spine, but I pushed it aside. By the time we returned to the cabin, long streaks of afternoon light cut through the trees, illuminating floating dust like tiny fireflies. The air felt cool and heavy with pine. It was quiet, too quiet, until I noticed a car parked crookedly near the gate. A familiar compact blue sedan, and a man pacing beside it, thin, nervous, wringing his hands. "Is that?" Sarah asked. "Her husband," I said. He spotted us and practically jogged up the drive, stopping short once he reached the porch. "Mr. Cole," he said breathlessly. "Mrs. Cole. I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I had to warn you." Sarah stepped forward. "Warn us about what?" He swallowed hard, glancing back toward the car. "Bethany's not well. She didn't sleep at all. She's convinced you're plotting against her. She says the HOA's future depends on stopping you." Sarah and I exchanged a look. "She left early this afternoon," he continued. "Said she was drafting emergency enforcement directives. She locked the office, piled papers everywhere. She's not listening to anyone anymore." He lowered his voice, fear trembling through it. "Please be careful. When she feels cornered, she becomes someone else." Before we could respond, the distant rumble of gravel stirred the air. An SUV approached, kicking up a tail of dust. It was Marcus. He parked beside the sedan and stepped out, holding a thick folder under one arm. The sheriff's expression was carved with fatigue, but when he saw us, he managed a nod. "Afternoon," he said. "Good timing. I've got something for you." He joined us on the porch and opened the folder. Inside lay a single document with the judge's stamp at the bottom. A restraining order, signed, effective immediately. Sarah let out a slow breath of relief. I hadn't realized how tight her shoulders had been until they quietly dropped. "She crossed enough lines," Marcus said. "And early this morning, the judge agreed with that." He tapped the page. "She's prohibited from contacting you, approaching you, stepping onto your property, or sending any representative, volunteer or otherwise." Bethany's husband shut his eyes briefly, as though hoping this might end everything. But fate, or Bethany, wouldn't give us that much mercy. A sharp squeal of tires erupted from down the hill. A sedan roared into view, fishtailing slightly on loose gravel. Dust exploded behind it. The car lurched to a stop just yards from the porch, engine revving like it wanted to bite the earth. The door flew open. Bethany Reed stepped out. Her hair was wild, makeup smudged, blazer crooked. She clutched a stack of papers in one hand, a phone in the other. Her eyes locked onto us with something far past anger, something unraveling. "Don't you dare!" she screamed, stumbling toward the porch. "Don't you dare put restrictions on me! I am the HOA president! You don't restrain me! I restrain you!" Her husband rushed toward her, but she jerked away. "Traitor!" she spat. "You never support me!" Marcus moved down the steps, one hand raised in a calming gesture. "Bethany, stop right there. We need to talk." She ignored him and marched closer, her heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "You people think you can humiliate me? Destroy my work? Undermine community order?" Marcus planted himself firmly between her and the porch. "Bethany," he said, voice steady as bedrock, "I have a court order for you." He held the paper out. Her eyes flicked to the restraining order, then widened, trembling. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, no. I don't accept this." She tore the paper from his hand and ripped it in two. The shreds fluttered to the ground like pale leaves. "That just voided itself," she shouted. "I reject your authority." Marcus didn't flinch. "The order stands, ma'am. Tearing it doesn't change a thing." Her breathing grew wild. "You think you can silence me? You think you can trap me with paperwork? I am the HOA!" Her husband stepped toward her again. "Bethany, please." She shoved him so hard he stumbled back into the ditch grass. That was it. The officers moved. Not violently, not harshly, but decisively. They guided her arms behind her as she kicked and twisted, shouting accusations that made no sense. "You're all against me. You're destroying property values. This community will fall without me." Her voice cracked, then broke entirely. Marcus looked at me over his shoulder, tired, worried, resolute. "This had to happen," he said quietly. "For everyone's sake." Bethany screamed one last time before the patrol car doors closed, muffling her voice into something small and hollow. Her husband stood shaking beside the road. Sarah slipped her hand into mine, and for the first time since 3:42 a.m., the forest felt like it could breathe again. But that breath didn't last. As the patrol car disappeared down the gravel road, the fading sunlight dimmed across the lake. A wind rose from the west, slow at first, then colder, heavier, pressing against the trees like a hand warning them to brace. I stood on the porch, feeling the boards shift under me as the temperature dropped. A quiet unease clung to the air, the sort that carried the promise of something unfinished. "She's gone," Sarah whispered. "At least for now." But the way she said it, the soft quiver beneath the words, told me she didn't believe it any more than I did. Bethany had unraveled in front of us, yes, but the kind of unraveling we witnessed wasn't surrender. It was ignition. The peeling of the last layer of restraint that kept her from acting out every wild idea she'd been circling for months. "Let's get inside," I said. "Storm's coming." We made dinner quietly, the clatter of pans echoing too loudly in the small cabin. The wood stove burned warmly, but the unease in the room made it feel colder. After eating, I walked to the window. Night had dropped fast, too fast. The sky was an ink-black sheet draped across the ridge, and the lake reflected none of its usual silver shimmer. Even the frogs were quiet. Something was shifting. Sarah handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing mine. "You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure. Just listening. To the trees creaking, to the glass humming softly, to the silence that pressed too tightly around us. We turned in early, but neither of us slept. Every few minutes, I checked the window or the porch camera feed. Nothing. No headlights on the road. No footsteps. Just the dark. Until just after midnight. A strange hum rolled across the treetops. Low, mechanical, steady. It vibrated through the window pane and into my bones. I bolted upright. Sarah sat beside me, already awake. "You hear that?" she whispered. "Oh, yeah." I stepped barefoot onto the cool floor, each board groaning softly beneath my weight. The hum grew louder, closer. By the time I reached the front door, it had turned into a harsh electronic buzz. I swung the door open. The forest exploded with white. Industrial floodlights, massive, bright enough to wash the trees in hard silver, flared to life from the clearing below. Shadows snapped across the cabin walls like fleeing animals. Dust lifted from the porch in thick, glittering sheets. And then I saw it. A drone. Not the little one from before. This one was 3 times larger, its LEDs pulsing red and white. It hovered just above the porch steps, mechanical limbs adjusting as if it were alive. A speaker crackled beneath its frame. Then Bethany's voice, high, shaky, recorded, boomed into the night. "Attention occupant of Parcel 14B. You are in violation of HOA condemnation protocol. Prepare for immediate compliance. Failure to comply will result in emergency property seizure." Sarah covered her mouth. "She didn't." "She did," I muttered. The drone dipped, released something metallic, then shot upward, vanishing into the glare of the floodlights. The object clattered onto the porch. I bent down and picked it up. A sealed plastic tube. Inside, rolled with precise edges, was a document stamped in thick red letters. Notice of demolition. Structure deemed hazardous, 48-hour removal order. Sarah stared at it in disbelief. She forged a demolition notice? "Not even cleverly," I said, turning it over to see a fake seal that looked like it came from a craft store clearance bin. "This violates the restraining order," Sarah said. "She's digging herself into a deeper hole." "Yeah," I said, "but she's also dragging us with her if we don't act fast." I grabbed my phone, took photos of the tube, the floodlights, the scorch of dust rising around the clearing, and the path the drone had flown. The air hummed as the lights continued their blinding assault. "We need to go," I said. "Right now." "To where?" Sarah asked. "To the sheriff." We threw on jackets and boots. The wind cut across the driveway as we climbed into the truck. Pine needles danced across the windshield as we bounced down the road, the floodlights still flaring behind us like artificial moons. It was a 15-minute drive, but tonight it felt longer. The darkness seemed to lean closer with every mile. My hands tightened on the wheel. "This isn't just harassment anymore," Sarah said. "She's weaponizing everything she can fabricate, and now she's ignoring law enforcement entirely." "At least the order gives Marcus something real to work with," I said. We pulled into the sheriff's gravel driveway. The house sat quiet under dim porch lighting. But before we reached the steps, the front door cracked open. Marcus's silhouette appeared, shoulders squared, as though he had already guessed who was coming. "Bethany?" he asked grimly. I held up the tube. "She sent a demolition order by drone." Marcus inhaled sharply, stepping aside. "Get in here." Inside his living room, under soft lamplight, we laid everything out. The document, the photos, the timestamps. Marcus examined them with slow, deliberate silence. His eyes hardened as he read. "She violated a court order within hours," he said. "This crosses into criminal territory. I'll call deputies to pick her up immediately." He stepped away to radio dispatch. When he returned, his tone had changed. Lower, more urgent. "We're heading back to your cabin," he said. "If she's bold enough to deploy drones after being detained, she might make another move before deputies reach her home." Sarah swallowed. "You think she'll come up the hill again?" Marcus met my eyes. I think she's past thinking. We followed him out to his SUV. The engine growled awake, headlights sweeping across the gravel in wide arcs that lit up the pine trunks like pale pillars. The night wind howled through the branches, scattering dust and broken needles across the road. As we drove behind him toward the cabin, the trees grew darker, thicker, leaning in over the road as though trying to hide what lay ahead. The floodlights still glowed faintly behind the ridge. The lake, just beyond, reflected none of it, just a black, glassy stillness. Sarah placed her hand on my arm. "We're almost there," she said quietly. But something in her tone told me she knew as well as I did. We weren't heading back to calm. We were driving straight into the final act of whatever Bethany Reed had just unleashed. As we curved around the last bend, the forest opened just enough for the cabin to appear, and right then, the world erupted in blinding white. Floodlights snapped on all at once, brighter than before, aimed directly at the porch like interrogation lamps. Shadows stretched violently across the clearing. The pine branches glowed like bleached bones. Marcus slammed his brakes. "Good Lord," he muttered. Sarah gripped the dashboard, her breath catching. She came back. Not only came back, she prepared. Figures moved in the glare. Not deputies, not workers. Just one silhouette standing defiantly at my gate, illuminated from behind like she was posing for a dramatic portrait. Bethany Reed. Her blazer was wrinkled, crooked, her hair wild, and across her chest was something new, a sash that read, HOA Commander, in big homemade letters. She held a megaphone in one hand and something heavy, metal, and sharp-edged in the other. Bolt cutters, again. But this time, her stance wasn't frantic. It was determined, unhinged, but calculated. Sarah whispered, "She's completely gone." I couldn't argue. We climbed out of the truck. Gravel shifted under our boots. The air tasted like dust and cold metal, thick with static from the floodlights. Marcus stepped forward first. "Bethany," he called, voice deep and commanding. "Put those tools down!" His voice echoed off the lake, but she didn't even flinch. Instead, she raised the megaphone. "Attention, violators of community order!" her distorted voice blared. "You have resisted correction. You have refused compliance. Under HOA Supreme Directive, I am authorized to seize this property for emergency aesthetic preservation." Her words bounced wildly through the trees, nonsense wrapped in certainty. She moved closer to the gate, the bolt cutters clanging against the chain. Sparks flew when metal hit metal. "Bethany!" Marcus barked. "Stop immediately!" But she spun toward him, megaphone amplifying her fury. "You, Sheriff, you have failed this community. You protect the enemy. You are complicit in decay." Her voice cracked into something raw. Her husband appeared then, breathless, stumbling up the path behind her. His face was washed with fear. "Bethany, please," he begged. "Stop this. You're making it worse." But she shoved him aside so hard he lost his footing, tumbling into the grass. Sarah gasped. I started toward him, but Marcus threw out a hand. "Stay back," he warned. Deputy headlights swept across the ridge as 2 patrol cars crested the hill. The arriving deputies stepped out, tense, hands hovered near their belts, not reaching for weapons, but ready for intervention. Bethany turned toward them, bolt cutters raised like a twisted symbol of authority. "You can't stop me!" she screamed. "I am the HOA!" Marcus's voice thundered across the clearing. "Enough!" He stepped forward closer, his silhouette cutting through the floodlights. "Bethany Reed," he said, tone steady but hard as stone. "You are violating a court order. You are trespassing, and you are endangering yourself and others. Drop the cutters." Her voice wavered. No, if I stop, the community collapses. Property values plummet. Disorder wins." "This isn't about property value," Marcus replied. This is about you losing control." She shook her head violently. "I am in control. I am restoring order." Then she lunged forward, toward the gate, toward us, the bolt cutters swinging. The deputies moved instantly. They didn't tackle her. They didn't grab her roughly. They simply redirected her momentum, guiding her arms back, securing her hands, speaking calmly even as she thrashed and screamed. "No, no, you can't arrest me," she wailed. "I am the HOA. I command this community. You have no authority over me." Her voice cracked into sobs and shrill rants all at once. The bolt cutters slipped from her fingers, clattering against the rocks. One deputy gently nudged them away with his boot. "Bethany," Marcus said softly, tiredly, "this isn't leadership. This is crisis. And you need help." She didn't hear him, or couldn't. They guided her toward the patrol car. She twisted once more, eyes blazing. "You!" she screamed at me, voice trembling with madness. "This is your fault! You're destroying everything!" I didn't respond. There was nothing to say, not to a person who had built an entire reality in her head and believed it harder than the ground she walked on. As they placed her inside the back seat, her voice collapsed into broken hysterics, muffled by the closing door. The floodlights buzzed overhead, humming through the silence left behind. Sarah stepped closer to me. "I didn't think," she swallowed. "I didn't think she'd fall this far." "Some people," Marcus said quietly, "build an identity so fragile they can't let anything challenge it, even the truth." Her husband stood near the ditch, shoulders trembling. He wasn't crying, but he looked hollow, lost. "I tried to stop her," he said softly, "but she didn't want help. She wanted control." Marcus placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "She'll get an evaluation. She'll get treatment. And she'll get boundaries she can't bend." The deputies began shutting down the floodlights. Darkness crept back across the clearing, slow but welcome. Without the harsh glare, the forest looked exhausted, like it had weathered a storm of its own. Sarah leaned her head against my shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. "Isn't it?" I let out a long breath, the first full, deep one in what felt like days. "It's over for her," I said. "But the HOA? The mess she made? We'll see." Because a structure built on her delusions could still collapse. And sometimes collapse sends shockwaves. But for now, at least, the night exhaled. And the mountain was quiet, again. The deputies stayed on the property line until dawn, their patrol lights dimmed but still pulsing faintly through the trees like steady, protective heartbeats. Sarah and I didn't go back to sleep. We sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, mugs warming our hands, watching the night slowly peel itself into morning. By the time the first hint of gold crested over the ridge, the world felt strangely new, like someone had pressed reset on the forest. The lake shimmered softly, tiny ripples catching the early light. Birdsong returned cautiously, as if the wildlife had been waiting for confirmation that the chaos had passed. When the deputies finally signaled they were heading out, I walked with them to the gate. "She'll be held for evaluation," one of them said. "Charges will follow once they determine her mental state." "Will she stay away after that?" I asked. The deputy offered a measured sigh. "With the restraining order and the arrests, yes. And if the court mandates treatment, that's likely the end of her reign." Reign. The word hung in the air like lingering smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. After they left, I returned to the porch. Sarah was staring out across the lake, arms hugged loosely around herself. Not tense, just absorbing the stillness. "Feels different today," she murmured. "It does." "Light," she said after a pause, like the mountain let out a breath it had been holding. We ate breakfast quietly. Then we both stepped outside to do something we hadn't done in days. Walk the property without scanning the tree line every few seconds. The remnants of her madness still lingered. A few toppled floodlight stands abandoned near the clearing. The bent metal gate latch she'd tried to cut, and half buried in the grass, the laminated demolition notice she'd dropped earlier in the night. I picked up the notice, shaking my head. Feels like a souvenir from a nightmare. An exhibit, Sarah corrected with a wry smile. But yes, also a souvenir. We carried the trash to the burn pile behind the shed. Most of it would go straight into evidence boxes, but some pieces, like the spider web of fake violation slips plastered on the porch, felt like emotional clutter. Clearing them made the cabin breathe better. Mid-morning, a familiar pickup rumbled up the drive. Tom, our neighbor from down the hill, stepped out holding a white paper bag and 2 coffees. "Figured you might need these, Thomas," he said, handing them over. "Heard the fireworks last night." I laughed. Fireworks might have been easier. He leaned against the porch rail. HOA board's already in meltdown. Half the members didn't even know she'd filed expansion petitions. The others pretended they did but couldn't explain what they were supporting. And now? Tom lifted a shoulder. Now they're realizing she built the entire HOA around, well, herself. No one wants to admit they've enabled that. Sarah shook her head. People like her don't rise alone. They need followers. And followers get scared when the leader gets hauled off screaming about supremacy clauses made out of thin air, he replied. We shared a tired but genuine laugh. He stayed a few minutes longer, catching us up on gossip, board resignations, emergency meetings, the discovery that Bethany had invented an entire beautification council that never existed. Eventually, he headed home, leaving behind a little more normalcy than we'd had when he arrived. By afternoon, the air had warmed. I walked the property line again, not because I feared anything, but because routine felt good, felt grounding. When I reached the far edge near the woodshed, something caught my eye beneath a fallen branch. A familiar color, bright, artificial, pink. I bent down and plucked it from the leaves. One of Bethany's hair rollers. It must have fallen off during one of her frantic marches up the hill. I turned it over in my fingers. It felt absurdly small, just a plastic cylinder, harmless, meaningless, but somehow it carried the weight of everything we'd endured. Sarah appeared beside me. "What's that?" "A relic," I said. I walked it to the fire pit, struck a match, held the flame until it caught the edge of a pine needle, dropped it gently over the roller. It curled inward, melting into a soft puck of dripping plastic. A tiny puff of smoke lifted into the pine-scented air, delicate, fleeting, final. We stood there for a moment, watching it disappear. Then Sarah took my arm. "Let's go to the dock." We walked down to the lake. The boards creaked under our weight, warm from the sun. The water sparkled, clear and calm, reflecting the sky like nothing had happened. The breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. A small fish rippled the surface near the pilings. I sat on the edge and let my boots dangle above the water. Sarah sat beside me, shoulder against mine. "You did well," she said softly. "We did well." "Law held," she said. "It always does, even when someone tries to twist it into a weapon." I nodded slowly. The weight in my chest loosened, replaced by something quiet and warm. "We've got our life back," she added. We watched the sunlight stretch across the lake, long and gentle, painting the world gold. Peace didn't shout its arrival. It whispered. And for the first time since 3:42 a.m., I believed it would stay. If you've ever stood your ground for what's right, drop a simple yes in the comments, or just leave a justice if an HOA has ever tried pushing you around. Stories like this remind us that peace is worth protecting, and nobody should be bullied off their own land. And if you'd like to ride along for more HOA showdowns and ranch-side justice, feel free to subscribe. I'd be glad to have you here for the next one.